Voicemail came at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning. I was still in my scrubs from the night shift, standing in the hospital parking lot with my keys in my hand, when my phone buzzed. It wasn't a call, it was a voice message from my mother, left while I was triaging a patient with a fractured wrist. I pressed play. "We've talked it over," she said. Her voice was calm, almost bored. "Your father and your brother agrees. You've made your choices and we've made ours. Don't come to Thanksgiving. Don't come to Thanksgiving. Don't come to Christmas. As far as this family is concerned, Brooke, you've removed yourself." The message ended. 7 seconds of silence, then a beep. I stood there in the November cold, the kind that bites right through your coat in Winnipeg, and I waited for the feeling to hit me. The collapse. The desperation. I'd spent 31 years being told I was too sensitive, too dramatic, too much. I waited for the part where I called her back and apologized for something I hadn't done. It didn't come. Instead, I got in my car, turned the heat up, and opened my banking app. In emergency nursing, you learn fast that there's no room for grief in the middle of a crisis. You file it away. You deal with what's in front of you. What was in front of me was a mental list I'd been keeping for years, a list of every financial thread that connected me to the family that had just quietly, calmly cut me loose. The first thread was the cell phone plan. I'd been paying for 4 lines since my brother Garrett moved back home at 26 after his second failed business. That was 3 years ago. The plan was $210 a month, automatic withdrawal, set up under my name because my father said his credit score couldn't handle another account. I went into the carrier's app and removed the 3 lines that weren't mine. I didn't call to warn anyone. I didn't send a message explaining what I was doing. I just removed them and switched to a single-line plan. The second thread was the Netflix, Prime, and Disney Plus accounts. Small things, but they'd been on my card for so long that nobody remembered who originally set them up. I changed the passwords. All of them. My mother had used that Disney Plus account to watch Christmas movies with my niece every December. I thought about that for exactly 3 seconds. Then I moved on. The third thread was the one that would take longest to unravel, and that was fine. That was the point. 2 years earlier, my parents had asked me to co-sign on the line of credit for my father's renovation business. He needed $40,000 to cover materials for a large contract he'd landed, a commercial build in the St. Vital area of Winnipeg. He said it was temporary. He said he'd have it paid down before the end of the fiscal year. He shook my hand at the kitchen table like we were business partners. I co-signed. The contract fell through. My father blamed the contractor, then the city permitting office, then the economy. The line of credit sat at $38,500 accruing interest. My name was on it. My credit score was absorbing the impact every single month. I had been meaning to talk to a lawyer about my options. I'd been putting it off because every time I thought about having that conversation, I thought about my mother's face and how much she would cry, and I would decide it wasn't worth the fallout. That morning, sitting in the hospital parking lot at 6:52 a.m., I decided it was worth it. I called my financial advisor when her office opened at 9. I was home by then, sitting at my kitchen table in Transcona with a coffee going cold beside me. I told her I needed to understand every legal avenue available to me regarding a co-signed debt where the primary borrower had defaulted on the original agreement. She told me to come in that afternoon. I didn't sleep. I made another coffee, opened my laptop, and started a document. I called it the ledger. I had never written any of it down before. It had all lived in my head, organized by date and dollar amount, because that's how I'd survived. By knowing exactly what I was owed so I could remind myself that I wasn't crazy when my mother told me I was ungrateful. The ledger started in 2018, when I lent my parents $11,000 to cover 6 months of mortgage arrears on their house on Beaver Hill Boulevard. The house had been in my father's family since his parents built it in the 70s. He couldn't let it go to the bank. I understood that. I didn't have $11,000 in savings at the time. I worked a second job at a walk-in clinic on weekends for 4 months, and I sent them money in installments until it was covered. They told the neighbors they'd refinanced at a better rate. My name was never mentioned. The ledger continued through 2019 when Garrett decided he was going to open a food truck. He needed $6,000 for equipment deposits and licensing. My parents didn't have it. I did, barely, because I'd just gotten a raise at the hospital. I gave it to him as a loan. We wrote nothing down. By 2021, the food truck was gone. Garrett was back in his childhood bedroom, and when I gently brought up the money at a family dinner, my mother looked at me like I'd said something indecent. "He's your brother," she said. "Family doesn't charge family interest?" As though I had charged interest. As though I had charged anything at all. I kept typing. By noon, the document was 4 pages long. The total was $61,400 over 6 years, not counting the cell phone plan or the streaming services or the 100 smaller things. The groceries I bought when I came for Sunday dinners because I could see the fridge was low. The winter tires I put on my father's truck one year because he mentioned offhand that he'd been putting it off. The birthday money I sent my niece that my brother never once acknowledged. $61,400. I stared at the number for a long time. Then I closed the laptop and got ready for my meeting. My financial advisor, a sharp woman named Denise who had been helping me manage my money since I was 25, did not look surprised when I walked in and told her what had happened. She'd heard the edges of the family situation before. She pulled up my file and we went through the co-signed line of credit carefully. "Your best position," she said, "is to send formal written notice that you're withdrawing from any informal financial agreements and to document everything you can. For the co-sign debt, you'll want to talk to a lawyer about whether you can pursue the primary borrower for damages if the account goes further into default." I told her I'd already made a list. She looked at the document I'd printed. She didn't say anything for a moment. "Brooke," she said finally, "you should have come to me sooner." "I know," I said. "I thought I was managing it." I drove home with 3 referrals in my bag and a clarity in my chest that I hadn't felt in years. It was a strange feeling, not happiness. Something closer to a door swinging open in a room that had been sealed for a long time. That evening, my phone lit up. Garrett's name on the screen, then my father's, then my mother calling from a number I didn't recognize. Probably a neighbor's phone because she'd realized her cell service was gone. I watched the calls come in and I didn't answer. I'd blocked the numbers I knew. The ones I didn't know, I let go to voicemail. I listened to the voicemails later, the way you might watch storm footage from a safe distance. My father's voice was controlled and cold, the specific tone he used when he wanted to sound reasonable while saying something threatening. Garrett sounded irritated rather than worried, which told me everything about what they thought this was. A tantrum, a phase. Something I would walk back if they waited me out long enough. My mother's message, left from a number with a River Heights area code, was the one I played twice. "I don't know what you think you're doing," she said, "but this is not how family behaves. Your father's phone doesn't work. Garrett's data is off. You are hurting people who love you over nothing. Call me back and we'll talk about this like adults." Over nothing. I deleted it and went to bed. The call came 11 days later, not from my parents. From my Aunt Sylvia. Sylvia was my father's older sister, the family member who had quietly observed everything for 30 years from a careful distance. She lived alone in a small house in East Kildonan, drove a sensible sedan, and did not attend family events unless the occasion was significant. She called me on a Wednesday afternoon. "Your grandmother passed this morning," she said. Peacefully, she went in her sleep. I sat down. My grandmother, Eileen, had been 91 years old and had been declining for the past 2 years. I had driven to her care facility in Steinbach every few weeks because nobody else did. My parents visited on holidays. Garrett had been there twice in 3 years, but I had gone because she was sharp and funny and had told me once, when I was 23 and crying at her kitchen table over something I no longer remember, that I was the only one in the family who had ever figured out that love was a verb. She left instructions, Sylvia continued. "Mr. LeBlanc is handling the estate. The reading is Friday afternoon at his office on Portage. Eileen wanted family present. She paused. She was very specific about who she meant by family, Brooke. I asked her what that meant. She was specific, Sylvia said again, and then she said goodbye. I spent Thursday like I was preparing for a job interview. I went through my closet and I chose carefully. I owned good clothes. I wore them at work and at the professional development events I attended and at the conferences I'd spoken at, but I did not pull those out. I found a cardigan I'd owned since nursing school, a soft gray one with a small pill on the left sleeve, and I paired it with jeans and flat boots. I pulled my hair back loosely. I practiced in the bathroom mirror the way you practice a clinical skill, deliberately, without shame. I let my shoulders drop. I made my eyes a little unfocused, the way they go when you're overwhelmed and trying not to cry. I practiced the slight tremor in my hands that you get when cortisol spikes. In the ER, we sometimes let a combative patient believe they have the upper hand, just long enough to get the help we need in position. I had learned from the best. Mr. LeBlanc's office was on the 14th floor of a building on Portage Avenue, a quiet, carpeted space with the particular hush of rooms where important paperwork is signed. I arrived early and sat in the waiting area. When my parents walked in, my mother scanned the room and found me immediately. Her expression shifted through surprise, calculation, and a kind of pity that she had been refining for 30 years. She wore a black dress I recognized from my grandfather's funeral. "Hannah, you made it," she said, then caught herself. "Brooke, sorry, you look tired." She always did that. Confusion of names, always someone else's name, always delivered as an accident. I had stopped pointing it out years ago. My father sat down without looking at me. Garrett stood by the window and checked his phone. My Aunt Sylvia sat in the corner nearest the door and watched all of us with the patient attention of someone who has been watching this family for decades and has stopped being surprised by what she sees. Mr. LeBlanc entered and opened a file that was thick enough to carry its own gravity. My grandmother's estate was not extravagant. It was not $3 million in a manor house. Eileen had been a retired school librarian who had lived carefully and invested quietly for 40 years. What she had was hers entirely, because she had built it on her own after my grandfather died in 1989. The house in East Kildonan, paid off, assessed at $380,000, a TFSA and an RRSP together holding $290,000, a non-registered investment account with $145,000 in it, a small-term life policy worth $50,000, $865,000. My father leaned forward when Mr. LeBlanc finished reading the asset summary. I watched him do the math. I watched my mother's hand tighten around his forearm. Garrett had finally put his phone away. Mr. LeBlanc cleared his throat and looked up over his glasses. "The estate," he said, "in its entirety is designated to Eileen's granddaughter, Brooke. There is a separate letter also prepared by Eileen, which I'll distribute after the formal reading." The room went quiet the way rooms go quiet after something irreversible. Then my father said, "That's not right." Mr. LeBlanc did not blink. "It is precisely right. I prepared the documents myself. Your mother was entirely lucid at the time of signing, and the will was witnessed, notarized, and filed with the courts." "She was 91, my father said. "She didn't understand what she was doing." "She had a clearer understanding of what she was doing than most people half her age," Mr. LeBlanc said. He said it without heat, just as a fact. My mother turned to look at me. Her expression had shifted again. This time it was something I recognized too, the specific look she gave me when she needed something and was calculating how to ask for it. "Brooke." She said my name like she was correcting a wrong answer. "You know this isn't what Grandma would have wanted. We're family. We should work through this together. You've always been so overwhelmed by financial things. We can help you manage this. We can set up something where everyone—" "I'm fine," I said quietly. I let my voice go a little unsteady. "I'm just really sad about Grandma." My mother blinked. I let my chin drop. I twisted my hands in my lap. I watched my father notice the cardigan, the flat boots, the undone hair. I watched him decide in real time, that I was exactly what I had always been in his story about our family, the one who needed guidance, the one who couldn't handle things without help. It took 11 minutes. My father leaned toward Mr. LeBlanc and said that given Brooke's history of financial difficulty, which he cited using the co-signed line of credit as evidence, he would like to propose a family trusteeship. He said he was happy to manage the estate on behalf of the family. He said this was what Eileen would have wanted. Mr. LeBlanc listened. He nodded. He said that this was certainly an option the family could pursue, and that if there were grounds to challenge the heir's competency, there was a mechanism in the will for that. My father straightened immediately. Garrett looked up from his phone. A challenge of competency, Mr. LeBlanc continued, can be initiated by any named beneficiary. However, Eileen anticipated this possibility and included a clause that I should draw your attention to. He looked at my father, then at my mother, then at my mother. If any party challenges the primary heir's competency and fails to substantiate that claim, they forfeit any and all secondary bequests named in the will. My father frowned. What secondary bequests? Eileen left $15,000 to each of her children, yourself included, contingent on the smooth transfer of the primary estate to Brooke. If the primary transfer is contested, those secondary bequests are dissolved. Silence. My father looked at my mother. I watched the calculation happen between them in the way that long-married people communicate without speaking. $15,000 was not nothing. Not to them, not right now, with the renovation business struggling and the line of credit still open. We're not contesting anything, my mother said quickly. We just want to make sure Brooke has support. I straightened in my chair. I let the cardigan hang off my shoulders. I met my father's eyes for the first time that afternoon. I appreciate that, I said, and my voice did not shake at all. The letters came a week later, courier delivered to my apartment. Mine was 2 pages in my grandmother's handwriting, which I recognized from birthday cards she'd sent every year without fail. The looping, deliberate cursive of a woman who had taught children to love books for 35 years. She said she knew what she was doing. She said she had watched me for 31 years and understood that what I had given this family, in money, in labor, in silence, had been taken without acknowledgement and without gratitude. She said she was sorry she hadn't said it sooner out loud. She said she trusted me to know what to do with what she was leaving me. She said to stop apologizing for things that weren't my fault. I folded the letter and put it in the drawer where I keep important documents, next to my nursing license and my RRSP statements and the printed copy of the ledger. My parents called twice that week and I let both calls go. My father left a message that was careful and measured and ended with a mention of the line of credit, how difficult it was, how it was affecting the business, how we hoped we could find a way to discuss it like reasonable people. My mother texted once. It said, "We miss you." I showed the text to Denise at our next meeting. She looked at it and handed my phone back to me. "Do you want to respond?" she asked. I thought about 31 years. I thought about the voicemail in the hospital parking lot, the one that had come in at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning while I was doing my job. I thought about the way my mother had stood in Mr. LeBlanc's office and reached for my name like she was reaching for a tool. "No," I said, "not right now." What I did instead was call a family law and estates lawyer who had been recommended by Denise. I asked about my options regarding the co-signed line of credit. She told me that because I had documentation proving I received none of the benefit from the original loan, and because my father had defaulted on the repayment terms he had verbally agreed to, I had grounds to pursue him for damages to my credit. She said it would be a long process. She said it was winnable. I told her to start the paperwork. My father called the cosign the week after the proceedings began. His voice on my voicemail was the loudest I'd heard it in years. He said I was destroying the family. He said Grandma would be ashamed of me. He said Garrett needed that money, that the line of credit was the only thing keeping them afloat, and that if I cared at all about the people who raised me, I would call this off. I played the message once. I forwarded it to my lawyer. She used it in the proceedings. I didn't attend my family's Christmas that year. I drove to Steinbach on the 23rd and I sat in the parking lot of the care facility where my grandmother had spent her last 2 years. And I thought about all the Sundays I'd driven that highway to sit with her and watch her read the paper and argue gently with me about municipal politics and tell me stories about the students she'd loved over 40 years of librarianship. I cried in the car by myself for about 20 minutes, which felt like the right amount of time, and then I drove back to Winnipeg and had dinner with two of my colleagues from the unit who were also working the holiday weekend. The Beaver Hill house sold in February, not to a bank. My father managed to find a buyer, which I found out through Sylvia, who kept in touch with me in the careful, unhurried way that she did everything. She said the sale cleared the mortgage and left very little. She said my father and mother were renting now, in a neighborhood I didn't know. She said Garrett had moved to Calgary to start over. She said she thought I was handling everything very well. I thanked her. The legal process with the co-signed debt took 14 months. At the end of it, I was removed from the account and my father was solely responsible for the outstanding balance. My credit score recovered over the following year. Denise ran me new projections in the spring and the numbers looked, for the first time in my adult life, like they actually belonged to me. I used part of my grandmother's estate to pay off my own student loans. I put the rest into a combination of a TFSA and a non-registered account that Denise helped me structure. I gave myself 2 weeks off in June and drove out to British Columbia because I'd been meaning to for years and kept finding reasons not to go. I thought about my family sometimes the way you think about a weather event after it's passed, not with hatred, with a certain flat clarity. They had not been malicious in the way that requires plotting. They had been something more ordinary and more difficult to name. People who had needed me to be less than I was so that they didn't have to reckon with how little they had built on their own. My mother sent a card in April. It was a regular card, a watercolor bird on the front, the kind you can buy in any drugstore. Inside, she'd written 4 sentences. She said she thought about me. She said she was sorry things had gotten so complicated. She said family was family, no matter what. She said the door was always open. I read it standing at my kitchen counter. I set it down. I thought about whether I felt anything. I felt something small and careful, not forgiveness, not its absence either, something more like, I see you, and I am choosing what I carry forward. I put the card in the recycling bin. I finished my coffee. I went to work. Some debts don't get repaid in the currency they were taken in. Some of them get paid forward, quietly, in the form of a life you build so solidly that no one can ever again tell you it doesn't belong to you. My grandmother understood that. She spent 35 years teaching children that a story isn't just what happens, it's what you decide to keep. I kept the parts that were mine. The thing nobody tells you about being the dependable one is that dependability, when it goes unacknowledged long enough, stops feeling like a virtue and starts feeling like a sentence. I spent years believing that if I just kept showing up, kept covering the shortfall, kept being the person who didn't make things harder, eventually the people I was doing it for would notice, not with a parade. Just a word. Just once, without me having to ask. It didn't happen that way, and I think, if I'm being honest with myself, I knew it wouldn't. I just wasn't ready to act on what I knew. What changed wasn't the voicemail. The voicemail was just the moment the door finally swung open on something I'd been standing outside of for a long time. What changed was what I chose to do in the parking lot afterward. I didn't call back and apologize. I opened my banking app. That was the first decision I made entirely for myself in years, and it felt like something clicking back into alignment. I've thought a lot about what made it possible to do that. Part of it was practical. I had a document in my head, years of dates and dollar amounts and favors extended without return, and having that clarity meant I could act without second-guessing what was real. That's something I'd call plain good sense, the kind you build by paying attention to your own life instead of managing everyone else's story about it. My grandmother had it. She watched our family for decades with clear eyes and drew her own conclusions. She didn't need anyone to confirm what she saw. Neither in the end did I. Part of it was knowing the difference between loyalty and obligation. I had confused the two for most of my adult life. Loyalty is something you give because you believe in the person or the relationship. Obligation is something that gets installed in you by people who need you to feel responsible for their choices. My father signing that co-ownership without a plan, my brother treating a loan like a gift he'd already decided not to return. Those weren't my failures to fix. Untangling myself from them wasn't cruelty, it was just honesty, finally directed inward. And part of it, the part that took the longest, was learning to stay steady when the pressure came. Because it did come. The voicemails, the mentions of the line of credit, the card my mother sent in April with its 4 careful sentences about open doors. Every one of those was a test of whether I would hold the position I'd taken or fold back into the shape they'd grown used to. I didn't fold. Not because I stopped caring, but because I'd done the harder work of caring about my own life as much as I'd been trained to care about theirs. Eileen understood something about all of this without ever putting it into a speech. She just left me a letter in her looping handwriting that said, essentially, I see you. What you built is real. Keep going. I think that's all any of us are really looking for. Not rescue, not a windfall. Just someone who looks at what we've actually done and tells the truth about it. The rest, you have to build yourself. And you can.